there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in the East on another extraordinary day of breaking news that reveals the scope of the fallout from Donald Trump's big lie for the Republicans who continue to choose to this day to be complicit with it. First, the latest in Donald Trump's second impeachment trial, now just 5 days away. Just in the last hour, an attorney for Trump tells NBC News exclusively that Trump will not testify during his second impeachment trial next week. His response comes hours after Democratic impeachment managers formally requested Trump's testimony under oath, either before or during the trial. Lead impeachment manager Jamie Raskin, in that request, addressing the former president directly, previewed how Trump's absence at the trial could be used against him. Quote, "You have attempted to put critical facts at issue, notwithstanding the clear and overwhelming evidence of your constitutional offense. If you decline this invitation, we reserve any and all rights, including the right to establish at trial that your refusal to testify supports a strong adverse inference regarding your actions and inaction on January 6th. The major development comes as the clash between liars and those seeking to hold them accountable opens another phase. Fox News, and specifically the anchors Lou Dobbs, Maria Bartiromo, and Jeanine Pirro, have been slapped with a $2.7 billion lawsuit filed by yet another election technology company. And finally, the story unfolding at this hour on the House floor, where in a matter of minutes, debate is getting underway ahead of a vote that will determine whether the GOP has any appetite to separate itself from the conspiracy theorist in its ranks. Or, in the other corner, whether it wants to descend into the darkest corners of American political life and forever stain the GOP with QAnon conspiracy theories. That's the choice. It's that simple. Should be, at least, before Republicans at this hour. Marjorie Taylor Greene has targeted for harassment the young survivors of school shootings. She has called the 9/11 attacks on the Pentagon a hoax, and she claims that Charlottesville protests and counter-protests were an inside job. More recently, Greene cheered on the January 6th insurrectionists, comparing what would become a deadly riot to the American Revolution. Greene also cements the GOP caucus as tolerant of racism. Her speech about Muslims and Black Americans is so offensive, we're not going to amplify it or repeat it here. To be clear, the vote that is getting underway minutes from now, it isn't even to purge Greene from the GOP caucus, send her home. No, it's just a vote about whether or not to strip her of her committee assignments. That's it. And Republicans could have done that all by themselves, could have taken care of business privately. But they refused to take any action themselves because there wasn't enough opposition to Greene and QAnon within the GOP. Let that sink in. Today, with her committee assignments on the line, Greene took to the House floor to offer, I don't even know what to call it, a half-hearted semi-walkback of some of her worst, most offensive claims. It's not worth repeating the excuses she offered or her belated acknowledgement that school shootings and 9/11 were real after all, especially since her speech today directly followed this defiant tweet sent out this morning. Quote, "It's not just me they want to cancel. They want to cancel every Republican. Don't let the mob win." Greene wrote that. Don't let the mob win. Now, either she has no sense of irony or is teaching a masterclass in projection. Greene and the mob are one and the same. Greene and the mob are on the same side. Greene and the mob and the insurrectionists are all on the side that stormed the Capitol in that deadly riot. And the mob is now under intense scrutiny by law enforcement, with serious charges beginning to pile up. The mob is really hoping that the GOP votes with them, lets Greene slide today. While the rest of us, we're just waiting and watching to see if the Republican Party will separate itself in any meaningful way from the mob today. That is where we start our coverage with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Tim Miller's here, former RNC spokesman and contributor to The Bulwark. Also joining us, Jason Johnson, journalism and politics professor at Morgan State University. He's a contributor to MSNBC and The Grio. MSNBC political analyst, former Senator, my friend Claire McCaskill's here, and MSNBC's Garrett Haake is live for us on Capitol Hill. Garrett Haake, we start with you where it's all going down. What's the latest?
Well, we're in a motion to adjourn right now, a procedural step by House Republicans to draw this process out. Frankly, caught me a little bit by surprise because I think a lot of the thinking was House Republicans knew they were going to have this vote today. They weren't particularly excited about the prospect of having to defend Marjorie Taylor Greene, and they were just going to kind of yank this tooth, get through this vote, and move on. But look, it looks like here's where we are. This speech that Greene gave on the floor today, I'm told, is very similar to the one she gave behind closed doors to Republicans last night. I think it may be enough to consolidate Republican support behind her, but I don't think it convinced a single Democrat to change how they feel about her comments, both before she was a member of Congress and up till this very day. I talked to a Democratic member after her speech today who told me, said she's never done drugs. Maybe she should, that this is just sort of stuff that's too far out of bounds, too far from the normal to come back and be explained away. But I think the key thing that we've learned today from Speaker Pelosi, who talked about this a little bit at her news conference, and from other Democrats that I've talked to is, as a member of Congress elected by your constituents, you can come here and say, the moon landing was fake and the earth is flat and birds aren't real, but you can't project violence. You can't endorse violence on your colleagues. And that's the line that Democrats feel like they absolutely have to draw here today, and why they're going to have this vote, and why, if the numbers continue to look the way they've looked all day, Marjorie Taylor Greene will be stripped of her committee assignments in an unprecedented move before the sun goes down tonight.
Garrett, I just want to poke a little bit in this notion that she's said anything on the floor that solidified GOP support, because it's revealing. I'm sure your reporting is accurate, but it's revealing. So what she said was that she stumbled upon QAnon at the end of 2017 when she was searching online because she didn't trust the media. The conclusion, she said, quote, "Will we allow the media that is just as guilty as QAnon of presenting truth and lies to divide us?" I mean, that's demonstrably false. And if that line, quote, "Will we allow the media that is just as guilty as QAnon of presenting truth and lies to divide us?" If that line won them over, we've got bigger problems than Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah, let the record show I've never accused anyone of being a lizard person or a cannibal, and I'm a card-carrying member of one of those groups, the media, not QAnon. Look, Republican members, we've talked about this in other contexts, Nicole, and I think it's important. Republican members in a lot of districts look back at their constituencies and they don't fully understand them. And in many cases, they're confused by them or even a little bit nervous or afraid of elements of their voters back home. And the QAnon thing is part of that. And I think I think a lot of members heard that and thought, okay, so she flirted with QAnon and she backed away from it. A lot of people in my district are probably the same way. That may be good enough. And the other thing they're going to fall back on, and you're going to hear this quite a bit in the next hour of debate when it resumes here, is the idea that this is just Democratic overreach, punishing her for speech before she came here. I don't think that carries much water, but those are the arguments upon which House Republicans have built their defense or their willingness to look away from Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Claire McCaskill, I need to bring you in here, my friend. I mean, this feels at this point like a charade. I mean, someone trotted her out, likely Kevin McCarthy, to the floor to offer an apology, and she said that she stumbled upon QAnon. She's basically, it's heroin, and likened it to the media. That's not an apology. That should have zero impact on what happens today.
It should, but I have just to take a moment here at the beginning. Happy birthday to you, Nicole. And I will confess, this is part of my husband's birthday cake. His birthday was on Monday.
Do you have a cake? I have to put on my glasses.
And I do not want to sing, because if I sing, we'll lose every single person in the audience. So I will not sing. I'll blow out the candle for you. But happy birthday, my friend.
Oh, thank you. Oh, and Honey the dog just ran through. We were losing complete control, and it's only 4:09.
Losing control. Okay, so
thank you.
Let's go back to Crazy Town. Let me go back to Crazy Town for a minute. Here is the biggest problem I had with the QAnon lady's speech on the floor of the House. She lied, Nicole. She said she'd said these things before she was elected. Yeah. She said these things after she was elected. On December 4th, she said that an article that called QAnon objective information and unifying for Christians was accurate. On December 4th, we're not talking about when she was in college. We're not talking about when she didn't know any better. This was after she'd been elected to the House of Representatives. She was lauding an article that called QAnon objective and saying how accurate that article was. She's lying on the floor of the House in order to avoid being removed from her committees. Now, the other part of this that's really interesting is if they would do a secret vote, she would have a wide margin of folks that would take her off of her committees, just like Liz Cheney had. Once they didn't have to be public, once they could hide and not have to be courageous, a lot of them did the right thing. Right. And I think they would today if they didn't have to go public.
It's so twisted, though. I mean, doing the right thing used to mean getting rid of the person that doesn't think 9/11 was real, and not too long ago. Tim Miller, I want to play you something that Senator Danforth had to say about today's GOP.
The Republican Party today is not just different from what it had been, it's the opposite in many ways of what it had been. America needs a strong, responsible, conservative party. That has been the Republican Party. It is neither strong nor responsible nor conservative today. But the worst thing is that we have become really a kind of a grotesque caricature of what the Republican Party has traditionally been.
Tim Miller, sounds like something you might say.
Well, I'm happy that Senator Danforth has been speaking out, and he's been really clear-eyed about Josh Hawley, who he was an early supporter of, and calling him out for participating in these lies. I think he's exactly right. I think the key word there is what the Republican Party has traditionally been. I think we need to recognize that the Republican Party is not what it's traditionally been. That doesn't mean that it was perfect in the past. That doesn't mean that we have to wipe away any Republican sins that happened before 2016. But what it does mean is that it has changed in a material way to the point where people like Senator Danforth, who was on the short list to be the vice president for George Bush, and where the vice president's daughter, Dick Cheney's daughter, Liz Cheney, are now out of step with this MAGA nationalist party. And I think that the key thing here is when we look at this vote today, and we're going to get maybe 10, 20 people that vote to condemn Marjorie Taylor Greene at best in this vote on the House floor. I think that what we have to recognize is that this is not just a vote condemning a kook. Right? There have been kooks in both parties for a long time. There are a lot of other kooks in the Republican Party besides Marjorie Taylor Greene, like Paul Gosar and Louis Gohmert. We could go down the list. This is about endorsing an ideology that was the underpinnings of the insurrection at the Capitol that resulted in the death of a police officer. That is what QAnon is. That is what Marjorie Taylor Greene has been espousing. And if all of these members that were participants in that cannot clearly denounce it, not just denounce the violence, but denounce the lies that underpin the violence, they all should lose their committees, and she should be the first in the line. And it's really important when we talk about this, that it is within that context of what happened on January 6th, that needs to be an eye-opening moment, and that it can't just be, oh, well, this is a kook, just like they had Todd Aiken, who was a kook in the past, and just like they had all these other kooks. This is a materially different thing.
Well, Jason, Tim makes such a good point, and it should be, I think, brought into the sort of forefront of these conversations. This isn't to suggest that normal Republicans are good guys. It's to suggest that this is so dangerous. How bad is this? It's so bad that this Republican caucus, if it gives QAnon lady a pass, becomes a homeland security threat to all Americans.
Yeah. I mean, Nicole, this is what, and you're making sort of the point that I've seen with this. I have been really apprehensive to put too much energy on Marjorie Taylor Greene because it makes her like the bad apple and sort of exculpates the rest of the Republican Party, many of whom feel exactly the same way. They're just not as loud and vociferous about it, right? She is being supported by this party, and this party as a whole is supporting an ideology that leads to terrorist activity. And honestly, look, I watched her speech today. I was thoroughly unimpressed. I was unmoved one way or another. If this was an apology from somebody's 7-year-old, you'd be like, no, go back to your room. You need to write that again. I don't think you're sincere. Because it's not just about what she said. Look, I'm a believer in freedom of speech, and I believe that your constituents can vote any person they want. They can be racist. They can be anything on the face of the planet. But she is calling for the death of elected leaders, and she's harassing people in the building. You know, her statement to Congress said nothing about what happened with Cori Bush, right, who now wants to move her office because Marjorie Taylor Greene basically threatened her and tried to spit COVID in her face. She says nothing about what she did with David Hogg. That's why this is a problem. Because if you have somebody who is in Congress who is posing a physical danger to their colleagues, I don't care if you're at Congress, the post office, or Subway, the guy at the office, the woman at the office who may be physically dangerous to other people, you have to limit their ability to do their job because they're a danger. So that's the part of this that I think is really clear, that the Republican Party as a whole, by sort of waffling on this issue, is saying we're okay with somebody in this building who could be a physical threat to others. And that is not the kind of, you talk about a hostile work environment, that's beyond hostile. That's a life-threatening work environment.
And Claire, just for any of our viewers who aren't familiar with QAnon, I know I wasn't. I think I pronounced it like quite the wrong way the first time I covered it, but that was a year ago. And Kevin McCarthy's fake act of not knowing who they were was BS. I mean, Donald Trump flirted with Greene and QAnon all through his own election. He stumbled in a question, an opportunity Savannah Guthrie gave him to distance himself from her. And what Marjorie Taylor Greene has endorsed is the execution of former President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and Hillary Clinton. I mean, this is really, this is the kind of political speech, as Jason's saying, that was directly sort of tied to the folks who stormed the Capitol, the insurrectionists who are now being charged with conspiracy. They're looking at sedition charges. Why is this so hard for the Republicans if they aren't where she is, just mad that she let it show?
Yeah, Kevin McCarthy saying he's not familiar with QAnon goes in the same category as that football coach from Alabama that got elected to the Senate, saying that he didn't know about the QAnon lady because it'd been bad weather and he hadn't had a chance to read about it.
Oh, that was Tuberville, yes.
Yeah. I call him the football coach, the former football coach, just like I call her the QAnon lady. I don't think either one of them are exactly deserving of the honorific at this point. So, I mean, this is just insulting to people's intelligence, which is really what QAnon is, the essence of QAnon. It's insulting to people's intelligence that people are peddling these conspiracies and that there are people out there that are buying into these conspiracies. And we all want to hope that our elected officials are the ones that stand up bravely in front of conspiracy theories and say, hey, guys, you know, there aren't lizard heads. There's not a satanic cult that's eating children and that are pedophiles that are part of the government. This is just not true. But Donald Trump, when he had the opportunity to do that, you know what his response was? They seem to like me. They like me. That was his only measuring stick, is whether or not they liked him. Right. And as has been eloquently said by my friend Jason, the professor, the issue here is advocating violence against elected officials.
Right.
That's the bright line. That's the line. You know, shame on her constituents for buying into her BS, but they did. And now this is about whether or not she should serve on committees, while she said it would be great if somebody put a bullet in Nancy Pelosi's head. That's the bottom line.
Right.
And Tim, you know, the other headline last night was that Liz Cheney was spared. But that's not a clean or good story for the Republicans either. 61 members of the caucus voted to strip her of her leadership post for the crime of voting to impeach Donald Trump for an insurrection. I've not seen video of any Republican roaming the halls bravely, aiding the Capitol police officers. We now know several lost their lives in the days since the insurrection. 2 took their own. So what is the sort of lasting imprint on the vote to leave Liz Cheney sort of in place, but for 61 of her colleagues to have voted against her?
Well, first, I just want to say, on balance, I'm happy that Liz Cheney is still in there. Look, I mean, I think that we're dealing with bad options here, and it's better to have Liz Cheney in there than, Lauren Boebert or whoever was going to replace her, right? And so I do think that your point, though, about this trend is important. If you remember, there was this massive story in, I think it was 2013 or 15, when Speaker Boehner was challenged by the Freedom Caucus wing within his party, by the Tea Party wing. Jim Jordan was still around. 17 Republicans voted to overthrow him for wanting to work with President Obama on immigration issues. 17. So now that number is almost quadrupled. If you fast forward 5 years, we can see which way this trend line is going. And let me tell you, and Senator McCaskill had this exactly right earlier, if that wasn't a secret vote, Liz Cheney would have been maybe squeaking by the barest margins. That would have been a much closer vote if it wasn't secret. The biggest part of the Republican caucus is the fear caucus. They're afraid of their voters. They're afraid of Jim Jordan. They're afraid of Marjorie Taylor Greene. They don't want to get primaried, and they're going to do whatever they have to do to keep them happy. So they were given a gift by being able to support Liz Cheney in secret. Had they had to vote in public, I think that a number of them would have been singing a different tune. And so I think that is the other major takeaway from last night. Let's see them put their money where their mouth is, now that they have to talk about it in public.
And we're going to get into the new lawsuit against those anchors at Fox News that we mentioned in the lead, Jason Johnson. But until the disinformation is not pumped into the voters, they'll remain afraid of their voters. And we can spend a month talking about what leadership is and is not. But I think my 9-year-old knows that leadership is not being afraid of the people that you were elected to lead, improve their lives, improve their economy, improve their communities, improve their roads. And that used to be one of the reasons that people go to Congress, to make the lives of their constituents better. This idea that they're all afraid of their voters and afraid of Jim Jordan would be funny if it weren't so tragic.
Yeah, and honestly, Nicole, I think it's a bit of an excuse. Justice Amash isn't afraid.
Yeah.
See, when you're an elected official, you can be a leader. Your job is to go back to your constituents and say, hey, you may not agree with this vote, but that's why I did it, because I care about you. The people who are claiming, look, if you're a prison warden, it's okay to be afraid of the people you can. If you're a teacher of a really bad class, you can say, hey, I'm a little afraid of my students. I'm afraid of my football team, whatever. You can't say you're afraid of your constituents. The only reason you're afraid of your constituents is because you don't lead, because you're not willing to be courageous. You're not willing to be courageous. You're not willing to show integrity. I don't buy that excuse. It is always a passing of the buck. If you take a tough vote, stand for that vote, put on your big girl, your big boy pants, go home, tell your constituents, and move on. Because I promise you, even these red districts, right? They're infinitely more concerned with getting a $2,000 COVID relief check. They're infinitely more concerned with their roads. Yeah. They're infinitely more concerned with education than they are on your vote on Marjorie Taylor Greene. And any member of Congress who claims that their constituents care more about the vote of somebody who doesn't represent them than whether they can put food on the table is a liar and shouldn't be in office anyway. I don't buy that as an excuse at all. I think you got a lot of Republicans who agree with Marjorie Taylor Greene and want to hide behind fictitious, crazy constituents, or they just want to be cowardly because they don't want to take a strong position.
All right. On that note, let me tell you what's happening next. No one's going anywhere. When we come back, we're still watching the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, where debate is set to start any moment on Marjorie Taylor Greene. And soon, the vote will commence to remove her from her committees, putting the Republican caucus on record, every single one of them. They have to decide. They're on the side of the dark and angry political divisions, marked with ugly QAnon conspiracy theories, or if they're not. We'll be following that vote throughout these 2 hours. Plus, Donald Trump has been called to testify in his second impeachment trial. He says he will not show up. Our friend Andrew Weissman will break all that down for us, what that no-show means, and what Democrats can do about it. All those stories and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We are back. Tim and Jason and Claire are still with us. Tim, I want to come back to you on something that Congresswoman Lee just said in response to Claire's question about how many, if it was secret, might vote against Marjorie Taylor Greene maintaining committee assignments. I think we have to stop covering the Republican Party as though they're under the influence of Donald Trump. The New York Times reported on ties between a half a dozen Republicans and the militia groups that stormed the Capitol. The Republican Party is clearly QAnon tolerant if they're struggling so much in the last 48 days. And it's over. That part of the story is over. And now the question is whether donors and corporations want to give to the QAnon caucus. That's it. And there will be more reporting as the charges are filed against the insurrectionists about ties to the white militia groups and white supremacists. That is who they are. And the questions are over. They've answered them for us, haven't they?
Yes, look, even in that private caucus last night, there was reporting by multiple sources that said that half of the Republicans gave Marjorie Taylor Greene a standing ovation after her speech last night. So, look, at least half of this Republican caucus is completely enthralled to Q. I think, and there's another quarter of it that are scared of them and will do everything that they can to appease the Republican base, the far-right nationalist base, anytime that they're in public. And then there's just a small fragment of people like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger that are acting on principle. Just really quick on one other thing. It is incumbent on the Democrats to dare Donald Trump to testify. I wrote about this for the Bulwark, that he's not going to respond to a subpoena. This has to be a media play, and I just encourage Democratic leaders and visible Democrats to shame him. You know he's going to be watching that trial next week. Shame him and say that he is responsible for what happened at the Capitol, and if he believes himself to be innocent, that he needs to come and testify for himself.
Well, and the other point, I think, is that he's not complicated. I mean, offer him roadblock coverage. We'll carry it. I'll offer it to him. And it's I have a pointer. It's like holding, treats in front of a pointer. I mean, you hold up the airtime. You hold up the coverage. And if Donald Trump doesn't come, Jason Johnson, it's because his lawyers think he'll get himself in more legal trouble.
Yeah, I think any smart Democrat, for the imagery, what was it, Charlton Heston at the Republican convention, just talk to an empty chair, right? just talk to an empty chair of where Trump is supposed to be, ask him questions and pantomime whatever answers he would give. Look, everybody knows that Donald Trump is a liar. Everybody knows that Donald Trump wouldn't be able to really defend himself in public because even the people who he hired to defend him, half of them quit before this impeachment ever started. But I do think what's important to remember, and I'm glad people are making this point, that the more that we make this look like a trial, the better it is for public consumption. It needs to be made clear Donald Trump chose not to come defend himself in the face of these charges. Donald Trump couldn't put together a legal team because the American public needs to hear, oh, no, he's supposed to be here. He chose not to be because he was afraid. And Democrats have to hammer that point home next week.
My thanks to Tim and Jason. Claire is sticking around a little longer as the vote is set to start in the next hour.